the first time in a year almost. We're going to look at Revelation this morning. Revelation chapter 2. What we're going to do is we are trying to get a running start at the revival that we have coming up in April. And the book of Revelation is divided three different ways. In chapter 1, verse 19, Jesus tells John to write three things. Write the things which you have seen, which encompasses chapter 1, where Jesus comes to him in a very overpowering image, a visual image that he uses that is not the way you've seen Jesus before. And then he says, write the things which are chapters 2 and 3. He writes 7 letters to 7 different churches, and then he says, write the things which are to be after this or to come after this, which is the rest of Revelation, which are the events of the end times. So I want us to look this morning at the first church, the first letter that is written, and I want us to begin to get a sense of our own selves as we get closer and closer to the revival time. The revival will be the first week of April, starting that Sunday, which I believe is the first. So that'll be here before you know it, and we're going to try to get through as much of this as we can. If you go to the doctor's office, hopefully you'll go there and you will get a diagnosis of what is wrong with you. You'll get a prescription to fix what is wrong with you, and then there will be recovery in your life. Well, that's the way I see Christ handling these churches. He presents himself as a physician for each individual patient, all 7 patients, and then he gives them a diagnosis of what is wrong, what the problem is in their life, and then he gives them a prescription. He tells them the good things too, but he tells them what's wrong. He gives them a prescription. And then each letter ends with the possibilities if they receive that prescription with ears, if they have ears to hear and they receive it with a proper heart and apply it to their lives. So we're going to take each letter like that. The first letter covers the first 7 verses. Now I want to give you warning that this message is over an hour long. It's over an hour long. That's why you need to be back tonight. The first part of the message is not as important as the last part of the message. I know we'll probably lose 50% of the people before we come back tonight, but I'm going to try to avoid that. Come back tonight, it'll all fit together. So let me encourage you to do that. But this morning we're going to look at the patient, which is Ephesus. We're going to look at Jesus, which is the physician. If you went back and started in verse 12 in chapter 1 and read the description of Jesus that he presents himself to John as, and then you took the first part of each little letter to each church, you see that original way that he presents himself is broken up. To each letter, he kind of presents a little piece of that original overall visual description that he has of himself. He gives them each a little piece which has a purpose for it. So he starts off presenting himself as a physician in a certain way, and then he tells them what's good, tells them what the problem is. And we'll get through that much this morning when we think about what was wrong with the church at Ephesus. I am going to describe to you a church that is a tremendous church in many, many ways. It is the kind of church that many of us would want to be a part of. Now, if you move to a town, and some of you have moved into Hannibal in the last few years, and probably you did this, you may go to every possible church to try to find the church where God would have you to be. And as you would go to these different churches, you would find different things about each particular church that was unique to itself. You're going to find a different building. You're going to find a different congregation, different people, different sizes. You're going to find different pastors in each church. And you're going to find a different atmosphere in each church. And you're going to try to decipher which church is right for you. Now, when I was in seminary, they told us that it takes 9 months for a pastor to really know the kind of church that he is pastoring. It takes that long for everything to kind of, people to stop always being on their best and really show themselves and to get a sense of what a church is really like. But only Jesus, the head of the church, can walk in and give an immediate message and saying, I know everything about you. I know you've got this that's right with you. I know that you have this that's wrong with you, and immediately tell you what you need to hear. And that's what we find happening here. John is given 7 letters for 7 different churches. All these churches are in a circular pattern in what we would look at today as the country of Turkey, but back then they called it Asia. Asia Minor, I think you'll probably find on a lot of maps. But gave a message for each particular one of these and was to be sent out to them and there was application to each one of these different churches. These churches are all existing at the same time in history, and yet they are very unique from one another. And in fact, if you laid these churches end to end as far as what you find happening in each particular church, you could take the 2,000 years of the church age and almost get an idea of how the church has gone from age to age, starting with the age of Ephesus, which would be, Ephesus literally means desired one. And we often look back at the New Testament era and say that's the desired model that we want for a church. Starting there and going all the way to the end church, which is the church at Laodicea, which is a church that is lukewarm, a church that is so offensive to Christ that he wants to literally vomit it out or spew it out. And that is the church of the end days, the church that the Antichrist will find so much available room to operate in. But this morning I want us to look at this particular church, which is the Ephesian church. This is the, I guess, second book written to the Ephesian church. Paul wrote one, and now we find Jesus through John writing a letter, a shorter letter, obviously, to this particular church. Ephesus was a unique place at the time that this letter was written. In a political sense, it was a very, very important town. It had a strategic position where the harbor that it was on the Cayster River was a very important harbor, and people would stop there on their way to Rome. Whenever people would be Roman prisoners brought out of the Asian area, they would stop in Ephesus, and it got the name of being the highway of martyrs, because they'd take them there. It was a Roman stopping place, and then they would take them on to Rome for punishment whenever they came out of Asia. It was also called the Light of Asia. It was called the Marketplace of Asia. It was a very, very important town. Very modern in a lot of ways for that time in history. If you would have arrived at the harbor in Ephesus and got out of your boat and headed into the inner core of the city, you would have walked on a half-mile long road that was 35 feet across. It'd be like walking down McMaster's all the way to maybe Bowling Ford or somewhere like that, and it would be a totally marble road. They really put the money in to the front doormat. I mean, you'd walk on this elaborate road. And then you'd come into the city. And the city was dominated by a temple atmosphere. In fact, we find this when Paul took his ministry trips to Ephesus. You found out that he ran into some problems there. Paul began to reach some people in Ephesus. People began to get saved, and it caused a literal riot to happen. If you remember in Acts chapter 19, that one man in particular, Demetrius the silversmith, was very angry about the Apostle Paul and the success he was having in ministry. Now the reason he was upset is he was connected, being a silversmith, to making these little images, these little idols. In Ephesus you could pick up idols of everything, everywhere. They used to wear little idols around their necks. They had actual idols that you would put on a chariot, on almost a dashboard of a chariot, like we would put on maybe on the hood of a car. They would put an idol out there. And Demetrius had a lot of involvement in that. That was the way he made his money. And a lot of the economy was geared toward this particular temple. Now this temple was a huge thing. It was called the Temple of Diana, or Artemis is another term that is used. And it was about 600 feet long. It had 120 pillars, columns along the front of it, about 60 feet high, and 36 of which were very elaborate. They had all this golden studding, jewelry, and a very rich look to the front of them. But this temple was a very, very pagan place. It served as a museum for art from all around that area. It also served as a bank because it was so holy in so many people's eyes that certain places in the temple you could not go into. Even if you were the worst thief, you wouldn't dare go back there, and people would put their money back in those holier places. But this temple was also a sanctuary or a refuge for criminals. Because inside here they had freedom from the law. And when you have that, you're going to have a lot of people who have trouble with the law wanting to come there, and it got so bad that the whole temple was full of criminals. If we harbored criminals inside Emmanuel Baptist Church, could you imagine how crowded it would be here on Sunday mornings? But it would be all a bunch of criminals. And that's what they found happening in the temple. In fact, it got so bad, so many criminals were there that they had to extend the boundaries of the freedom from prosecution all the way to the city limits itself. So if you can imagine Hannibal being that one place in the area that no criminal prosecution could have, you'd have people from all over our nation, guilty of various crimes, coming here because they'd be safe from any kind of legal action. And you can imagine what the atmosphere would be like here. And that's what Paul found in Ephesus. The temple itself had horrendous immoral practices. They had the thousands of priestesses and prostitutes. They had immoral activities with regard to their particular worship, the way they worship. And self-mutilation was something that was also part of their worship. Now, can you imagine Paul coming to a place like that? That would not be the highest mission destination that we would think of really being effective there. And yet Paul went there. In fact, Ephesus had some very positive things in a religious sense. Paul spent the longest ministry time, 3 years, in Ephesus. And Timothy also spent a lot of time in Ephesus. That was kind of a headquarter place for him as he ministered to the churches that were around that area. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is said to have died in Ephesus. We're also, we see in the Bible that Aquila and Priscilla, Apollos, all three had ministries in Ephesus. And then John lived in Ephesus before he was banished, and then he came back afterwards. Now what we find here is John on an island as an older man, the only surviving living apostle or disciple, and Jesus speaks to him and sends these series of letters, the first one being to Ephesus. So you get a sense of the patient. The patient doesn't look very healthy at all. But right smack in the middle of this sinful atmosphere is a church. Billy Graham estimated that this church in Ephesus was a very strong church, upwards of about 50,000 members. That is amazing to think of that kind of church thriving. But if you look at what you find in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 19, you can see that Paul had a tremendous ministry there. Demetrius incited a riot, and this riot went on. The shout in this riot, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," went on for 2 hours, just whipping the people up into a greater fervor. And part of the things that Demetrius said was, number one, he said that Paul is threatening the worship of Diana, an idol or an image that we have that has fallen out of heaven. They believe that when Alexander the Great came through town, some hundreds of years before, that Jupiter, their god, dropped an image of Diana into the city, and that is the image that they worshipped up until that day. And he goes on the next verse to say the second thing. He says, these are undeniable facts. It's amazing to me what people stand up and say are undeniable facts. And we deal with that in our world today with the deal surrounding evolution. People stand up and say these are undeniable facts. And there are so many holes in it that you can be shocked. But he was standing up and saying this image dropping out of heaven that we worship today, that Jupiter dropped on us, it's undeniable fact. And that's what he used to fight the ministry of the Apostle Paul, inciting the riot and having Paul almost killed when he was stoned to death. Well, Jesus writes this letter through Paul, and Jesus describes himself in a very interesting way. He says, these things says he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. Now that, you may be sitting there saying, that don't say a lot to me. That doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, I'm more confused by Jesus describing himself in that way as one who holds the stars in his right hand and one who walks amidst 7 lampstands. Well, if you go back to chapter 1 and look in verse 20, you find an explanation there. It says there that the 7 stars of the 7 angels are messengers of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So here he has in his right hand 7 stars, which chapter 1 says are the messengers of the angels to the church. Now there are 3 ideas behind that. Number 1 is that each church had a particular messenger sent from John with the letter, and that is the one that is being talked about here. The second is that each church actually had an angel. That there would be an Emmanuel Baptist Church angel that's watching out for us and making sure that we get the news we need to hear. But the third is probably the best in that they're talking about the messenger. Messenger and angel is the same word in the Greek. That they're talking about the pastors in the church that would be responsible for presenting this message to the church. You know, it says here that Jesus has him in his right hand. That is the hand of authority. That is the hand of strength. And you think about how hard these messages are going to be heard. You know, we don't like to hear things that we don't like to hear. We like for people to say nice things, encouraging things. But we're going to find things in these letters that are going to be very confronted and are going to tell us exactly what is wrong with each particular church. And one of the things that they need to know is that this message comes from not the pastor or the messenger. It comes from beyond that. It comes from Jesus Christ. Now, you may have problems with what your Sunday school teacher says. You may have problems with what a fellow Christian says. You may have problems with what I say. But if I can go back to the Bible and back it up, your problem is not with me. Your problem is with the Word of God. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here, that I hold these messengers in my right hand. It's going to be a hard word, but the word is from me. And he also calls each church, it says the lampstands are the 7 churches. We are a lampstand in Hannibal, Missouri today. We have the responsibility of channeling light from a resource outside of ourselves, channeling light so that there might be light within this community. But Jerry Falwell was sharing at the evangelism conference that Lynchburg, Virginia has so many churches in it, this community of 64,000, that they have virtually no crime problem. But I went to Korea some years ago, and Korea is a place where it is on fire for Christ. You know, I was told by the missionary there that you can go almost anywhere in town, he said anywhere in town, at any time of day or night, and be virtually free from any kind of danger. That lampstand, that light had had such an effect on the community that surrounds it. And they were a lampstand. This church, each church was a lampstand in its community and had the responsibility of emitting the light of the world, the light of Christ in that community. Well, here Jesus calls himself one who walks among these lampstands. You know, that tells me that Jesus is walking in the midst of the churches. He didn't just kind of get things going and kind of sit at the right hand of God and just kind of relax until it's time to come back. But he is active, he is walking, he is patrolling. You know, Satan prowls about like a roaring lion. He is constantly on vigil. And yet Christ knows everything. He is walking in the midst. He knows everything about the church. He knows what's going on. He always has a fresh word of direction for each one of us. So that's the way he presents himself. You have the patient, and then you have a physician who presents himself in a way that explains how he can help the patient. And then the first thing that you find being said are very positive things. The first things are very positive. And again, I would love for these things to be said about, this is what I would look for in a church. I would love for these things to be said about my attitude in a church. Look at what he says to the church at Ephesus. In verse 2 he says, I know your works, your labor, your toil, your patience, that you cannot bear those who are evil, that you've tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. He says, I know these things about you. You know, that's a strong word for know. It's the same word that is used for a husband and wife knowing one another. He's saying, I've considered the facts and I've come to a certain conclusion. I've given a thorough examination. Now, if you go to your doctor and you sit in the examination room, your doctor comes in and asks what the problem is, and you start sharing a few things that you've experienced as symptoms, the doctor might say, well, I have an idea what that might be. But then after you take a blood test, an x-ray, you go through a whole battery of tests that are possible, and then you sit back down with your doctor would say, I know without a doubt. That's a different word for know. I know for sure. I've examined all the evidence, I have all the facts, and I know for sure. And that's the same word that is used here. 3 things that he knew about them. Number 1, he said, I know that you're very hard committed workers. You're very hard committed workers. I know your works, your labor, and your patience. This was not a group of pew potatoes who never worked hard or labored for Christ. It is said that 20% do 80% or more of the giving and the serving in the average church. And that the average church is only going to expect, and that's a high expectation, to have 40% of the actual membership there on a particular Sunday. And Jesus is saying, you're not like that. I know your works, your labor, and your patience. You're the kind of basketball player that leaves it all on the court. You're not going to get to heaven and have anything left. You're going to do it all here that God gives you the ability and the strength to do. John MacArthur said that the average Christian, the toil of the average Christian wouldn't exhaust a butterfly. You know, that's how committed that they seem to be to the work of Christ. They were hard committed workers. The second thing you find that they were morally and doctrinally pure. They were a morally and doctrinally pure fellowship. It says you cannot bear those who are evil. You've tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and you found them to be liars. They had a problem back then that we have now, that people would come along with all these brand new theological ideas. They call themselves Reverend so-and-so or preacher or teacher so-and-so and teach all these wild and crazy things in the fellowship. In the 80s, Jim Baker was a very, very popular person. A lady in our church spent all day long. She lived right across the street from us. And she spent all day long with that, watching the PTL club. Well, things unraveled, and he ended up in jail, spent some years in jail, came out of jail, and wrote a book with a three-word title, I Was Wrong. Talking about the preaching that he had done about the health and the wealth gospel for all those years. He said, I was wrong. Well, here you have a church that set up barriers against things like that happening. They were a morally pure church. It says you cannot bear those who are evil. That meant that they dealt with those who would attempt to bring the evil of the world into the fellowship of the church, to bring the same attitudes, the same goals, the same desires. They would deal with those. That word for evil talks about people who would be injurious to the body, those who would have a tendency to corrupt others and to draw them into the same destruction that they themselves are walking in. They would meet people like that at the door and say, no way, you're not bringing that into this fellowship.